On overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with a treasury of common sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
Hello, Leith. How are you, mate?
Yeah, good, thanks, Phil. How about yourself?
I'm okay, but Labor's got this 5% deposit scheme. Is this a good idea or a bad idea?
Yeah, so this is unambiguously a bad idea. So just to recap, it was announced last August, so August last year, sort of towards late in the month, that Labor would expand its 5% deposit scheme for first home buyers. So basically, it used to be a scheme that was pretty tightly held. It had very low price caps, and you had to have certain income thresholds and that sort of thing. So not many people qualified for it. And what it basically did from 1 October last year, they expanded the scheme massively. So basically, there was no more income requirements. Anyone could qualify for it. The only thing that existed was there was some price caps that were implemented. So, for example, in New South Wales, any home, you could basically use the 5% deposit scheme if you're a first home buyer on any home valued under 1.5 mil, which is obviously, a very high amount, and that meant that, most homes were actually captured. So, or at least, sort of half of the detached house market and about 90% of units were captured when they bought in. And in Brisbane, the cap was set at $1 million. So that meant that about 42% roughly of houses were eligible and about 95% of apartments, or units, townhouses, that sort of thing. So it was basically massively expanded. And as expected, economists, me, a whole bunch of other people just thought this was an absolutely stupid idea, because whenever the government brings in these we call them demand side measures. So demand side stimulus. So whether it's a first home buyer's grant or this sort of thing, a shared equity scheme or a 5% deposit scheme, which allows people to buy the 5% deposit and the government basically guarantees the other 15%. What we end up doing is you end up bringing forward demand, and you increase demand for property, and then it ends up pushing up prices. So the federal government brought this scheme in, arguing that it was an affordability measure, but ultimately these sorts of schemes end up making affordability worse because they end up pushing up prices, and that ends up making housing more expensive. Now, Cotality, which is a major sort of housing research firm, and their house price data is what feeds the Reserve Bank and things like that. So it's kind of almost the official house price data firm for Australia. They released some research today, just came out at midnight, showing that over the first 6 months of this 5% deposit scheme, values for homes priced below the price caps of the scheme rose by 6.7% nationally over this first 6 months of the scheme. So talking October through to the end of March, whereas for properties outside the caps, prices rose by 3.6%. So effectively, prices below the cap where the 5% scheme are applicable rose at basically double the pace of properties outside the scheme. And this just basically proves unambiguously that this scheme has pushed up prices, and it's actually made housing less affordable. Now, for Sydney, so the Cotality actually provided some data just for the capital cities alone. Because I'm talking to a Sydney and Brisbane audience, I'll just quickly run through that. So for Sydney, homes priced below the caps over the last 6 months rose by 4.1%, whereas for homes outside the caps that didn't qualify, they actually fell by 1.1%. So we're talking about, basically a 5.2% difference in prices if they were within this 5% deposit scheme cap, or, if they weren't. And for Brisbane, prices below the cap rose by 13.3% over 6 months. So that is absolutely enormous growth. But prices outside the 5% deposit scheme's cap also rose by 10.1%. So it's obviously 3.2% difference, but strong growth either way. But however you cut this, Phil, basically it shows that this 5% deposit scheme has just made housing more expensive for first home buyers. And that's obviously not a good thing, because it is supposed to be an affordability measure. But if you're pushing up prices, and all it ends up doing is pushing up prices, it doesn't actually make homes more affordable, actually makes them less affordable. And that's obviously not a good thing. And if you actually sort of fast forward 5 years or so if this scheme stays in place for 5 years or whatever, we're going to be faced with a situation whereby if you're a future first home buyer, you're going to basically face the prospect of paying significantly more for a home than you would have otherwise if this scheme hadn't come. And you're also going to have to hold a much larger mortgage than you would have otherwise, because presumably you'll have to use this 5% deposit scheme to get in because housing is going to be more expensive. But then you'll have a mortgage that is bigger than it would have been otherwise, and you'll have a mortgage for 95% of the home's value instead of the traditional 80% of the home's value. So you're going to basically be a mortgage slave for the rest of your life, effectively, if under this scheme. And now I'm obviously blaming this scheme, but it's not just this scheme. Australian housing is structurally unaffordable. It's been unaffordable for decades, let's be honest. And it already was super unaffordable before this scheme came into effect. But this scheme has made the situation even worse. And if you segue it alongside the explosive growth in rents, which I talked about, previously, since the end of 2019, according to Cotality, rents across the nation have grown by 48%, and that's added $11,700 to the annual cost of renting. So this is a dire situation for a first home buyer, because if you're a first home buyer, you generally rent before you buy. And if you're spending more money on rents because rents have gone through the roof, it means you have more trouble saving a deposit. And because you can't save a deposit, you then have to take up these sorts of 5% deposit schemes, which the government's offering, but the 5% deposit scheme has pushed up prices. So you're basically damned if you do and damned if you don't. You can keep renting and just get absolutely hammered by rising rents, and rents are rising at a very quick pace, much faster than wages currently, because we've got a record low rental vacancy rate, and we're still running a very high migration program, which is overrunning the nation's ability to supply homes, which means the rental prices are getting worse. But at the same time, we've got this 5% deposit scheme that is also pushing up house prices, as well as immigration that's pushing up house prices, which is making housing more expensive at the same time as you're having more trouble saving a deposit, because rents are going up, so you're spending more on rent than you are on saving money to then purchase a house. So it's a pretty dire set of numbers here.
Yeah.
And it's basically, government failure on a whole bunch of levels. We're running an immigration system that is far too high, that's pushing up rents, etc., and also putting some upward pressure on prices. And we're also got silly policies like this, which are just actually adding more fuel to the house price bonfire and making housing structurally less affordable. So it's a pretty dire situation.
I wonder how long it'll be before people just give up, younger people, with the whole idea of ever owning a home, and just decide that that's pretty much like you said, they're never ever going to be able to afford one.
I think a lot of people already have, which is unfortunate. But unfortunately for them, because the rental market's so expensive, they're getting absolutely hammered there as well. So they are in a no-win situation. They can't afford a home, and then because they can't afford a home, they have to rent. But rents are surging at a pace that is well in excess of their income growth.
Yeah,
which just means that they're spending either they have the choice of spending a higher share of their lifetime earnings paying off a mega mortgage, or spending a higher share of their lifetime's earnings paying rent, because rents are rising faster than income. So it's really is a no-win situation, and I do understand why young Australians in particular are pretty angry about it.
Yeah, of course. Another great article, mate. Where can people find it?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. You can find it at macrobusiness.com.au.
There he is, Leith Van Onselen, the Treasury of Common Sense. From